Case 1. Robert Durst. Beverly Hills. Police received an anonymous note on December 24, 2000, containing a single word, cadaver, and an address, 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive, Los Angeles. Officers found Susan Berman, a 55-year-old journalist and author, shot once in the back of the head with a .22 caliber handgun. The execution-style murder appeared professional, but investigators focused on the anonymous note. The sender had misspelled Beverly Hills as Beverly Hills. 15 years later, that misspelling would connect the killing to Robert Durst, a billionaire real estate heir who had evaded justice for 4 decades. The same misspelling appeared in a letter Durst had sent to Berman years earlier. And in 2015, while being filmed for an HBO documentary about his life, Durst was caught on a hot microphone in a bathroom muttering to himself, "What did I do? Killed them all, of course." Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, in New York City, the eldest son of Seymour Durst, a real estate mogul who controlled the Durst Organization, one of the most powerful property empires in Manhattan. Durst claimed that at age 7, he witnessed his mother fall or jump to her death from the roof of the family mansion, a traumatic event that would shape his life. He attended Lehigh University, earning a degree in economics, and later enrolled in a doctoral program at UCLA before dropping out. In 1973, Durst married Kathleen McCormick, a medical student. The marriage was troubled from the start. In January 1982, Kathleen disappeared. Her body was never found, and she was presumed dead. Durst was the prime suspect, but charges were never filed. He received a $65 million settlement from his family after being estranged from the Durst Organization. In 2000, he married Deborah Lee Coraton. Durst had no children. In 2001, while living in Galveston, Texas, under an alias, Durst killed and dismembered his neighbor, Morris Black. He was acquitted of murder in 2003 after claiming self-defense, despite admitting to cutting up the body and disposing of it in Galveston Bay. Defense experts diagnosed him with Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism. By the time Susan Berman was killed in 2000, Robert Durst had been connected to 3 deaths over 2 decades and had never been convicted of anything. Susan Berman was 55 when she died. She was a journalist, author, and the daughter of Davy Berman, a Las Vegas mobster who had helped build the Flamingo Hotel. She had met Robert Durst at UCLA in the 1960s, and the two had remained close friends for decades. After Kathleen McCormick disappeared in 1982, Susan served as Durst's spokesperson, telling reporters that Kathleen had called her after leaving Robert and that she was alive and well. The claim was never verified. By 2000, Susan was living in Los Angeles and struggling financially. She relied on Robert Durst for money, and he sent her checks regularly to help her pay rent and bills. She was unmarried and had no children. She was known in literary and Hollywood social circles, but her career had stalled, and she was increasingly dependent on Durst's financial support. That dependence made her vulnerable. In late 2000, New York investigators, preparing to reopen the case of Kathleen McCormick's disappearance, contacted Susan Berman. She was expected to be questioned about what she knew. Robert Durst learned that the investigation was being revived and that Susan was likely to be called as a witness. On December 23, 2000, Durst traveled from New York to California using an alias. He went to Susan's home at 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive in Los Angeles. He shot her once in the back of the head with a .22 caliber handgun. The shot was execution style, clean and professional. Susan died instantly. Durst then mailed an anonymous note to the Beverly Hills Police Department, The note read "Cadaver" and included Susan's address. The note was intended to ensure that Susan's body would be found quickly. But in addressing the envelope, Durst misspelled Beverly Hills as Beverly Hills. He left the scene and returned to New York. When police discovered Susan's body on December 24, 2000, they had no immediate suspects. The case went cold. For 15 years, the murder of Susan Berman remained unsolved. Investigators suspected Robert Durst, but they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Then, in 2010, filmmaker Andrew Jarecki began working on a documentary about Durst's life. The project, titled The Jinx: The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, examined the disappearance of Kathleen McCormick, the killing of Morris Black, and the murder of Susan Berman. During the filming, Jarecki obtained a letter that Durst had sent to Susan Berman years before her death. The letter was written in Durst's handwriting and included Susan's address. The word Beverly was spelled Beverly. The handwriting matched the cadaver note, and the misspelling was identical. Confronted with the evidence during the documentary, Durst became agitated. After his interview, he went to the bathroom, still wearing a live microphone. Unaware that he was being recorded, he muttered to himself, "What did I do? Killed them all, of course." On March 14, 2015, the day before the finale of The Jinx aired on HBO, Robert Durst was arrested in New Orleans and charged with the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. The trial was delayed for years due to the COVID-19 pandemic and Durst's failing health. It finally began in 2021 in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Judge Mark Wyndham presided. The prosecution presented the handwriting evidence, comparing the cadaver note to the letter Durst had sent Susan. Both documents misspelled Beverly in exactly the same way, and forensic experts confirmed that the handwriting was identical. The prosecution also played the bathroom recording from The Jinx, in which Durst said, "Killed them all, of course." The defense, led by attorney Dick DeGuerin, argued that Durst had found Susan dead and had panicked. He claimed that Durst wrote the cadaver note to ensure that Susan's body would be discovered, but that he had not killed her. Durst took the stand and attempted to explain the evidence, claiming that the bathroom recording had been taken out of context. The jury did not believe him. On September 17, 2021, Robert Durst was convicted of first-degree murder. Judge Mark Wyndham sentenced Durst in October 2021 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Durst was 78 years old and in declining health. He showed little emotion during the sentencing. He had spent 4 decades evading justice for 3 deaths. Kathleen McCormick disappeared in 1982 and was never found. Morris Black was killed and dismembered in 2001, but Durst was acquitted. Susan Berman was murdered in 2000, and it took 21 years to convict him. On January 10, 2022, 4 months after his conviction, Robert Durst died of cardiac arrest while in state custody at San Joaquin General Hospital in California. He was 78 years old. He never served a meaningful prison sentence. He died before any appeals could be filed. Robert Durst is deceased. He died on January 10, 2022, at age 78, in state custody. He had been convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole just 4 months earlier. He spent less than a year in custody for the crimes of a lifetime. The Beverly misspelling, a small detail repeated twice, 15 years apart, connected Robert Durst to Susan Berman's murder. The bathroom confession he did not know was being recorded confirmed what investigators had suspected for 40 years. A billionaire heir who had evaded justice through wealth, privilege, and legal maneuvering was finally convicted at age 78. He died 4 months later. The documentary he agreed to participate in became the evidence that convicted him. Susan Berman protected Robert Durst for decades. He killed her to keep her silent. Kathleen McCormick disappeared in 1982 and was never found. Morris Black was killed and dismembered, but Durst was acquitted. Susan Berman was murdered in 2000, and justice came 21 years later. 3 lives destroyed, 40 years of evasion. And in the end, Robert Durst's own voice, captured on a microphone he forgot was there, delivered the confession that sealed his fate. Case 2. John du Pont Foxcatcher Farm in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, was built as a world-class wrestling training facility by a billionaire heir who wanted to support American athletes. The estate sprawled across hundreds of acres of rolling countryside, funded entirely by the DuPont chemical fortune. John du Pont drove across his own property on January 26, 1996, at approximately 2:50 p.m., and shot an Olympic gold medalist 3 times with a .44 Magnum revolver. David Schultz, 36, was working on his car in the driveway of his home on the estate when DuPont pulled up, rolled down his window, and opened fire. Schultz's wife, Nancy, watched from a window as her husband was murdered. DuPont then drove back to his mansion, barricaded himself inside, and engaged police in a 48-hour standoff. The question that investigators, prosecutors, and the wrestling community would spend years trying to answer was this: why would a billionaire philanthropist murder the coach he had recruited to train at the facility he had built? John du Pont was born on November 22, 1938, in Philadelphia, the great-great-grandson of Aimé DuPont, the founder of the DuPont Chemical Company. He was raised at Lister Hall, a sprawling mansion on the family estate, surrounded by wealth and privilege. He earned a Ph.D. in natural science from Villanova University and became an ornithologist, publishing scientific works on birds. In 1983, he married Gail Wenck. The marriage was annulled after 90 days. He had no children. DuPont was a philanthropist who poured millions of dollars into causes he cared about, particularly amateur wrestling. In the 1980s, he founded Team Foxcatcher, a state-of-the-art wrestling training center on his estate, and recruited some of the best wrestlers in the world to train there. Before 1996, he had never been convicted of any crime. But by the mid-1990s, DuPont's behavior had become increasingly bizarre. He suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had gone untreated for years. He believed that trees on his property were moving. He thought his skin was being attacked by clockwork bugs. He became convinced that people around him were part of conspiracies against him. Athletes and staff at Foxcatcher noticed the delusions but did nothing. DuPont was too wealthy, too powerful, and too important to challenge. His fortune was valued at over $200 million, and he controlled everything on the estate. David Schultz had won the Olympic gold medal in freestyle wrestling at the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. He was also a world champion and one of the most respected wrestling coaches in the United States. He was married to Nancy Schultz, and they had 2 children, Alexander and Danielle. The Schultz family lived on the Foxcatcher estate in a home provided by DuPont. David worked as the head coach for Team Foxcatcher and was supported financially by DuPont. He was beloved in the wrestling community for his kindness, patience, and dedication to the sport. Those who knew him described him as a man who embodied everything that was good about amateur athletics. He trusted John du Pont. He had no reason to believe that his employer and benefactor posed any danger to him or his family. By late 1995, DuPont's paranoia had reached dangerous levels. He began to believe that David Schultz was part of a conspiracy against him. The belief had no basis in reality. It was a delusion, a product of untreated paranoid schizophrenia. On January 26, 1996, At approximately 2:50 p.m., du Pont drove across the Foxcatcher estate to the home where David Schultz lived with his family. David was outside working on his car. Nancy Schultz was inside the house, looking out a window. Patrick Goodale, du Pont's security consultant, was in the car with du Pont. David approached the car to greet du Pont. Without warning, du Pont pulled out a .44 Magnum revolver and shot David Schultz 3 times. David died in the driveway. Nancy Schultz witnessed the murder. The children were nearby. Du Pont drove back to his mansion, went inside, and locked the doors. He refused to come out. Police surrounded du Pont's mansion within minutes of the shooting. Nancy Schultz and Patrick Goodale had both witnessed the murder, so there was no question about who had committed the crime. The challenge was getting du Pont out of his fortified mansion. He was armed and dangerous, and the mansion had extensive security measures. SWAT teams set up a perimeter, and negotiators attempted to communicate with du Pont. The standoff lasted 48 hours. Du Pont refused to surrender. Finally, on January 28, 1996, police cut off the heat to the mansion. It was January, and the cold forced du Pont out. He was arrested and charged with third-degree murder. The red flags that could have prevented David Schultz's death had been visible for months, perhaps years. Du Pont's delusions were known to athletes, staff, and family members, but no one had intervened. His wealth and position had insulated him from consequences, and the system had failed to protect the people who lived and worked on his estate. The trial began in September 1996 in Delaware County Court, Pennsylvania. Judge Patricia McElry presided. The defense, led by attorney Thomas Bergstrom, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense presented extensive psychiatric evidence showing that du Pont suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Experts testified that he believed trees on his property moved and that his skin was being attacked by clockwork bugs. The defense argued that du Pont was too mentally ill to be held responsible for his actions. The prosecution argued that du Pont was mentally ill, but that he understood the difference between right and wrong and was therefore legally responsible for killing David Schultz. The jury heard testimony from Nancy Schultz, who described watching her husband be shot. They heard from psychiatric experts on both sides. After approximately 2 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict on February 25, 1997. They found John du Pont guilty of third-degree murder but mentally ill. It was a compromise verdict that recognized his mental illness while holding him accountable for his actions. On February 25, 1997, Judge Patricia McElry sentenced John du Pont to 13 to 30 years in prison. The guilty but mentally ill designation meant that du Pont would receive psychiatric treatment while incarcerated. The Schultz family was devastated. Nancy had lost her husband, and Alexander and Danielle had lost their father. The wrestling community mourned the loss of an Olympic hero and one of the most beloved coaches in the sport. The Dave Schultz Memorial International Wrestling Tournament was established in David's honor. Du Pont was sent to a Pennsylvania state prison where he received treatment for his paranoid schizophrenia. He remained mentally ill throughout his incarceration. On December 9, 2010, John du Pont died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease at the State Correctional Institution, Laurel Highlands in Pennsylvania. He was 72 years old. He had served 13 years of his sentence. John du Pont is deceased. He died on December 9, 2010 at age 72 of COPD while incarcerated in Pennsylvania. He served 13 years of a 13 to 30-year sentence before his death. David Schultz was an Olympic gold medalist murdered by the billionaire who employed him. The warning signs were everywhere. John du Pont believed that trees moved across his property and that invisible clockwork bugs attacked his skin. Athletes and staff at Foxcatcher witnessed the delusions. But no one intervened because John du Pont was too wealthy, too powerful, and too connected. The fortune that built Foxcatcher Farm also insulated a paranoid schizophrenic from treatment until he killed. Nancy Schultz watched her husband die in their driveway. Alexander and Danielle lost their father. The wrestling community lost a hero, and the system that failed to act lost credibility. Wealth enabled the delusions to continue unchecked until they turned deadly. David Schultz trusted the man who funded his career. That trust cost him his life. Case 3. Phil Spector music producer Phil Spector emerged from his mansion in Alhambra, California, at approximately 5 a.m. on February 3, 2003, holding a gun. He walked up to his chauffeur, Adriano de Souza, who was waiting outside, and said, "I think I killed somebody." Inside the castle-like home known as the Pyrenees Castle, actress Lana Clarkson was dead in the foyer, shot in the mouth with a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver. Blood spatter covered Spector's white jacket. Teeth fragments from the gunshot were scattered on his carpet. The man who had created the wall of sound, a revolutionary production technique that had transformed popular music in the 1960s, had spent 4 decades threatening people with guns. John Lennon, Leonard Cohen, Joey Ramone, and members of the Ramones had all been held at gunpoint by Spector in recording studios. Multiple women had described being held hostage in his homes. Restraining orders had been filed, and on February 3, 2003, the pattern of violence that the music industry had tolerated for 40 years finally ended with a woman shot dead in his foyer. Harvey Philip Spector was born on December 26, 1939, in the Bronx, New York. His father committed suicide when Phil was 9 years old. Spector moved to Los Angeles and attended Fairfax High School. By his early 20s, he had become one of the most innovative music producers in the world. He created the wall of sound, a production technique that layered instruments and vocals to create a dense, reverberating sound. He produced the Beatles, Ike and Tina Turner, the Ronettes, and the Righteous Brothers. He transformed popular music and became a legend in the industry. He was married multiple times, most notably to Ronnie Spector, the lead singer of the Ronettes. He had children from various relationships. Spector had never been convicted of a crime before 2003, but he had a long and well-documented history of pulling guns on people. John Lennon described being held at gunpoint during recording sessions. Leonard Cohen said Spector had put a gun to his head. Joey Ramone and other members of the Ramones reported similar incidents. Multiple women, including Ronnie Spector, described being held hostage in his homes when they tried to leave. Restraining orders were filed against him. The music industry tolerated the behavior because Spector was a genius. He suffered from severe alcoholism and was suspected of having bipolar disorder. His net worth at the time of his arrest was estimated at $50 million. Lana Clarkson was 40 when she was killed. She was an actress whose most famous role had been in the 1985 film Barbarian Queen. By 2003, her career had stalled, and she was working as a VIP hostess at the House of Blues on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles to pay her bills. She was the daughter of Donna Clarkson and was single with no children. She met Phil Spector for the first time on the evening of February 2nd, 2003, when he came into the House of Blues. Spector was a regular customer, and Lana was working the VIP section. After spending time in the Foundation Room, a private club inside the venue, Spector invited Lana to his home for a drink. She accepted, likely hoping that a connection with a powerful music producer might revive her career. She had no way of knowing that within hours of meeting him, she would be dead. Spector arrived at the House of Blues around 11 p.m. on February 2nd, 2003. Lana Clarkson was working as a hostess. Spector spent time in the foundation room and asked Lana to join him. Around 3 a.m., Spector invited her to his home, and she accepted. They drove to the Pyrenees Castle at 1700 Grandview Drive in Alhambra. Both had been drinking heavily. At approximately 5 a.m., a gunshot was heard. Adriano de Souza, Spector's chauffeur, was waiting outside in the car. He heard the shot and saw Spector emerge from the house holding a gun. Spector walked up to de Souza and said, "I think I killed somebody." De Souza called 911. When police arrived, they found Lana Clarkson dead in a chair in the foyer. She had been shot in the mouth with a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver. Blood spatter covered Spector's white jacket. Teeth fragments from the gunshot were found on the carpet. The physical evidence indicated that Spector had been standing close to Lana when the gun was fired. The motive was consistent with a pattern that had played out dozens of times before. When women tried to leave Spector's homes, he held them hostage with guns. Lana Clarkson had likely tried to leave. This time, instead of holding her at gunpoint, Spector shot her. The investigation began immediately. Adriano de Souza's 911 call and his testimony provided a clear timeline. Spector had admitted to the chauffeur that he had killed someone. Forensic experts analyzed the blood spatter on Spector's white jacket and determined that the pattern was consistent with him being close to Lana when the gun was fired. Teeth fragments on the carpet showed the force of the gunshot. Gunshot residue analysis was conducted. 5 women who had previously been threatened by Spector came forward and testified that he had pulled guns on them when they tried to leave his homes. The pattern evidence was overwhelming. Spector was arrested on February 3rd, 2003, and charged with second-degree murder. He was released on $1 million bail. The defense claimed that Lana Clarkson had committed suicide in Spector's home and that Spector had been trying to help her. Phil Spector faced 2 separate trials. The first trial began in September 2007 in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Judge Larry Paul Fidler presided. The defense was led by attorney Bruce Cutler. The prosecution presented the blood spatter evidence, the chauffeur's testimony, and the testimony of 5 women who described Spector's pattern of threatening people with guns. The defense argued that Lana was depressed and had killed herself. The jury deliberated but could not reach a unanimous verdict. The trial ended in a mistrial in December 2007, with the jury deadlocked 10-2 in favor of conviction. The second trial began in October 2008. Judge Larry Paul Fidler again presided, and a new defense team led by attorney Doran Weinberg represented Spector. The prosecution presented the same evidence: blood spatter, the "I think I killed somebody" statement, and the pattern testimony from 5 women. The defense again argued suicide. The jury deliberated for 30 hours over 9 days. On April 13th, 2009, they returned a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. On May 29th, 2009, Judge Larry Paul Fidler sentenced Phil Spector to 19 years to life in prison. Spector did not speak at the sentencing and showed no remorse. Donna Clarkson, Lana's mother, gave a powerful victim impact statement expressing her devastation at losing her daughter. Judge Fidler noted that Spector had shown no remorse and posed a continuing danger. Spector was sent to California State Prison. His health declined during his incarceration. On January 16, 2021, Phil Spector died of COVID-19 complications at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California. He was 81 years old. He had served approximately 12 years of his 19-to-life sentence. He would have been eligible for parole in 2028. Phil Spector is deceased. He died on January 16th, 2021, at age 81, of COVID-19 complications while incarcerated at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California. He served approximately 12 years of a 19 years to life sentence. For 4 decades, Phil Spector threatened people with guns. John Lennon, Leonard Cohen, Joey Ramone, members of the Ramones, all had guns pulled on them in recording studios. Multiple women described being held hostage in his homes. The music industry tolerated the violence because of his genius. Restraining orders were filed and ignored. And then, on February 3rd, 2003, the pattern ended with Lana Clarkson shot in the mouth in his mansion. The chauffeur heard him confess, "I think I killed somebody." It took 2 trials, but the man who created the wall of sound was finally held accountable for the gunshot that killed Lana Clarkson. He died in prison at 81. His legacy forever tainted by the violence the industry had enabled for decades. Case 4. Alex Murdaugh. For nearly a century, the Murdaugh family had been the law in South Carolina's 14th Judicial Circuit. Randolph Murdaugh Sr., Randolph Murdaugh Jr., and Randolph Murdaugh III served as solicitor, the chief prosecutor, for a combined 87 years, making the family name synonymous with power and justice in Hampton County. Alex Murdaugh called 911 at 10:06 p.m. on June 7, 2021, and reported that he had found his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul, shot to death at the family's hunting estate near Islandton, South Carolina. Alex told investigators that he had been visiting his mother and had returned home to discover the bodies near the dog kennels. He said he had not been at the kennels earlier that evening. What Alex did not know was that a Snapchat video recorded by Paul at 8:44 p.m., just minutes before the murders, had captured Alex's voice clearly in the background. The video destroyed the alibi Alex was constructing. It placed him at the scene of the murders, and it set in motion the unraveling of a legal dynasty built on justice, but corrupted by greed, addiction, and murder. Richard Alexander Murdaugh was born on June 17, 1968, in Hampton, South Carolina. His grandfather and father had both served as solicitor for the 14th Judicial Circuit, and the family name carried immense weight in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Alex attended the University of South Carolina, earning a degree in political science in 1990, and then attended USC School of Law, earning his law degree in 1994. He married Margaret Maggie Branstetter in 1993, and they had 2 sons, Richard Alexander Buster, Jr., and Paul. Alex worked as a civil litigation attorney and became a partner at PMPED, a powerful law firm in Hampton. He also worked as a part-time prosecutor. Before June 2021, Alex had never been arrested or charged with any crime. But by that summer, his life was collapsing. He suffered from a severe opioid addiction that cost him up to $50,000 per week. To fund the addiction, he had stolen over $8.7 million from his law firm and from clients, including a quadriplegic man and the family of the Murdaugh's housekeeper, who had died in a fall at the family home. The thefts were about to be exposed. The law firm's CFO was asking questions. Client families were demanding answers. Alex's son Paul was facing trial for a 2019 boat crash that had killed a young woman named Mallory Beach, and the media attention threatened to expose the family's secrets. Alex Murdaugh was a multimillionaire, but he was facing imminent bankruptcy, disbarment, and criminal prosecution. The gathering storm was about to destroy everything. Margaret Maggie Murdaugh was 52 when she died. She was a University of South Carolina graduate, a philanthropist, and a homemaker. She was the mother of Buster and Paul and had been married to Alex for 28 years. By June 2021, the marriage was strained. Maggie had been living separately at the family's beach house, and friends later said she had been considering divorce. She trusted Alex and had no reason to believe he would harm her. Paul Murdaugh was 22. He was a college student at the University of South Carolina and the younger of Alex and Maggie's two sons. In 2019, Paul had been driving a boat while intoxicated when it crashed, killing 19-year-old Mallory Beach. Paul was facing criminal charges, and the case had brought intense scrutiny to the Murdaugh family. He was beloved by his family, despite the legal troubles. On the evening of June 7, 2021, both Maggie and Paul were lured to the family's hunting estate at OMERTÁ by Alex. Neither of them knew what was about to happen. By June 2021, the walls were closing in on Alex Murdaugh. His law firm was questioning missing funds. Client families were demanding accountability. His son's trial was approaching, and the media attention would shine a light on the family's corruption. Alex needed a catastrophic event, something so shocking that it would derail the investigations and generate sympathy. Alex left work on the evening of June 7, 2021, and drove to the family's hunting estate at 4147 Moselle Road in Islandton, South Carolina. He called Maggie and asked her to come to Moselle from the beach house. She agreed. That evening, Alex, Maggie, and Paul went to the dog kennels on the property. At 8:44 p.m., Paul recorded a Snapchat video of a dog's tail. In the background, Alex's voice can be heard clearly. At 8:49 p.m., Paul's phone stopped all activity. Between 8:49 p.m. and 9:02 p.m., Alex Murdaugh shot his wife and son to death. Paul was shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun, once in the chest and once in the head. Maggie was shot 5 times with a .300 Blackout AR-style rifle. Both weapons were family guns that had been stored at Moselle. After the murders, Alex's cell phone recorded 283 steps in rapid succession, indicating that he was moving quickly away from the scene. He drove to his mother's house, approximately 20 minutes away, and stayed briefly to establish an alibi. Then he returned to Moselle. At 10:06 p.m., he called 911 and reported that he had just found Maggie and Paul shot to death. Colleton County Sheriff's deputies arrived at 10:25 p.m. Alex was hysterical, screaming and crying. He told investigators that he had been at his mother's house and had returned home to find the bodies. He said he had not been at the kennels earlier that evening. Investigators processed the crime scene and began questioning Alex. In the early stages of the investigation, Alex was treated as a grieving family member rather than a suspect. His family name and connections initially protected him from scrutiny. But as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged. They obtained Paul's cell phone and found the Snapchat video recorded at 8:44 p.m. The video clearly captured Alex's voice at the kennels, just minutes before the murders. Alex had told police he was never at the kennels. The video proved he had lied. Investigators also analyzed Alex's cell phone data. Immediately after the murders, his phone recorded 283 steps in rapid succession, evidence of fleeing the scene. Vehicle GPS data showed that Alex had driven to his mother's house and then returned to Moselle. Forensic investigators found unfired .300 blackout cartridges near Alex's home office. Ballistics analysis matched the family's weapons to the shell casings found at the scene. And as investigators looked into Alex's finances, they discovered over $8.7 million in thefts from clients and his law firm. The financial motive became clear. Alex needed a catastrophic distraction. On July 14, 2022, Alex Murdaugh was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during a violent crime. He was already in custody for financial crimes. The trial began on January 25, 2023, in Colleton County Courthouse in Walterboro, South Carolina. Judge Clifton Newman presided. The trial lasted 6 weeks and was live-streamed, watched by millions around the world. Lead prosecutor Creighton Waters presented the gathering storm theory. Alex's financial crimes were about to be exposed, his son's trial was approaching, and he was facing total ruin. He killed Maggie and Paul to create sympathy and halt the investigations. The prosecution introduced the Snapchat video, which destroyed Alex's alibi. They presented cell phone data showing the 283 steps immediately after the murders. They introduced evidence of Alex's financial crimes to establish motive. The defense, led by attorneys Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, argued that 2 unknown shooters had killed Maggie and Paul in revenge for the boat crash that killed Mallory Beach. They claimed Alex was a loving father and husband who would never harm his family. They admitted Alex had lied about being at the kennels, but said the lies were the result of drug-induced paranoia. Alex Murdaugh took the stand and testified for hours. He admitted lying to investigators, but denied killing Maggie and Paul. The jury was not convinced. On March 2, 2023, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts. The sentencing took place the next morning, March 3, 2023. Judge Clifton Newman sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Alex stood stoic as the sentence was read. The courtroom was packed with media, the public, and family members. Alex addressed the court and said, "I'm innocent. I would never hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never hurt my son, Paul." Judge Newman responded with one of the most memorable statements in recent legal history. "I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the nighttime when you're attempting to go to sleep. I am sure they come and visit you." There were no victim impact statements from Maggie's family, as the family was divided. Alex's surviving son, Buster, had supported his father throughout the trial. In 2024, Alex's defense team filed a motion for a new trial, alleging that Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill had improperly influenced the jury by making comments about Alex's guilt during the trial. In January 2024, South Carolina Supreme Court Justice Jean Toll denied the request for a new trial. Appeals continue, but the conviction stands. Alex Murdaugh is 56 years old. He is incarcerated at McCormick Correctional Institution in South Carolina. His inmate number is 00390394. He is serving 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will never be eligible for release. He has been placed in protective custody due to his high profile. In addition to the murder convictions, Alex has been convicted of over 100 financial crimes in separate proceedings. Alex Murdaugh told his son Paul to record a video of the dog's tail. Paul did, capturing his father's voice at 8:44 p.m. at the dog kennels on June 7, 2021. 13 minutes later, Alex murdered Paul and Maggie with a shotgun and a rifle. When police asked if he had been at the kennels, Alex said no. The video he encouraged Paul to record destroyed that lie. A century-old legal dynasty built on justice ended with a lawyer murdering his wife and son to cover up financial crimes. Judge Newman was right. Maggie and Paul visit Alex every night. The video Paul recorded ensures they always will. The Snapchat video Alex told Paul to make became the evidence that convicted him. Perfect irony. Perfect justice. Case 5. James Sullivan. A man carrying pink roses rang the doorbell of a mansion at 4610 Sylvan Ramble Road in Buckhead, Atlanta on January 16, 1987 at 8:15 a.m. When Lita McClinton Sullivan answered the door, He shot her once in the head with a 9mm pistol and walked away. At that exact moment, Lita's estranged husband, James Sullivan, was on the telephone with his attorney in Florida, establishing what appeared to be an ironclad alibi. The alibi was too perfect, and it would take investigators 10 years to prove why. By the time the case was solved, James Sullivan had fled to Thailand and lived as a fugitive in luxury for years, funded entirely by the money he had saved by having his wife assassinated. The man with the pink roses was a hitman named Philip Harwood, and James Sullivan had paid him $25,000 to murder Lita because Sullivan did not want to give her half his fortune in a divorce. James V. Sullivan was born in 1940 in Boston, Massachusetts, and raised in a working-class Catholic family. He attended Holy Cross College and graduated with a degree that positioned him for a career in business. In the 1970s, Sullivan inherited a lucrative wholesale liquor distributorship from his uncle in Macon, Georgia. The business made him a multimillionaire. By the mid-1980s, Sullivan owned mansions in Atlanta and Palm Beach, Florida, and his net worth was estimated at over $5 million. In 1976, Sullivan married Lita McClinton, a Spelman College graduate and boutique owner from a prominent Atlanta family. The marriage lasted 11 years, but produced no children. By 1986, the relationship had deteriorated, and Lita and James separated. Lita filed for divorce. The divorce proceedings were bitter and contentious. Sullivan offered Lita a settlement of $250,000. Lita rejected the offer. She was positioned to receive half of Sullivan's multi-million-dollar estate in a trial, and she had every legal right to it. Sullivan was a narcissist, according to psychologists who later evaluated him. He could not accept losing control of his wealth or his image. Before 1987, he had never been arrested or charged with any crime, but he had the means, the motive, and the willingness to solve his problem with violence. Lita McClinton was 35 when she died. She was a Spelman College graduate, a boutique owner, and the daughter of Emery and Joanne McClinton, wealthy and politically prominent figures in Atlanta's African-American community. Lita came from money herself and was not financially desperate. She rejected Sullivan's $250,000 settlement offer, not because she needed the money, but because she deserved half of the marital assets. She was living alone in the couple's Atlanta mansion during the separation. She was accomplished, independent, and strong-willed. On the morning of January 16, 1987, she answered the door expecting a delivery. She had no reason to believe she was in danger. In late 1986, as the divorce proceedings intensified, James Sullivan made a decision. He hired a middleman in Florida to find a hitman. The middleman hired Philip Harwood, a man willing to commit murder for $25,000. Sullivan established a pattern of phone calls with his attorney, creating an alibi that would place him in Florida at the exact time of the murder. On the morning of January 16, 1987, Philip Harwood drove from Florida to Atlanta. He purchased pink roses from a florist. At 8:15 a.m., he rang the doorbell at 4610 Sylvan Ramble Road in Buckhead. Lita McClinton Sullivan answered the door. Harwood shot her once in the head with a 9mm pistol. Lita died in the foyer of her home. Harwood dropped the florist box and the pink roses and walked away. He got into his car and drove back to Florida. At the exact moment Lita was shot, James Sullivan was on the telephone with his attorney in Florida. The phone records would later confirm the call. The alibi was perfect. A neighbor heard the gunshot and found Lita's body. Police were called. There was no forced entry, which meant Lita had opened the door willingly. The pink roses and florist box were left at the scene. Investigators had no immediate suspects. James Sullivan's phone alibi was verified, and he appeared to have been in Florida when his wife was killed. Immediately after Lita's murder, Sullivan sold the Atlanta mansion, finalized his move to a $3 million estate in Palm Beach, and remarried within months. He moved on as though nothing had happened. The investigation into Lita's murder went cold. There were no witnesses who could identify the shooter, and Sullivan's alibi appeared to be solid. For more than a decade, James Sullivan lived freely in Palm Beach, enjoying the wealth he had preserved by murdering his wife. Then, in 1997, a woman in Texas named Belinda Trahan contacted the police. She told investigators that her ex-husband, Philip Harwood, was the man who had killed Lita McClinton Sullivan. Harwood was arrested and interrogated. He confessed. He admitted that James Sullivan had hired him to kill Lita. He described driving to Atlanta, purchasing the pink roses, shooting Lita in the head, and driving back to Florida. He said Sullivan had paid him $25,000. Harwood's confession gave prosecutors the case they needed. In 1998, James Sullivan was indicted for murder for hire. When he learned of the indictment, Sullivan fled the United States. He went to Thailand and lived in a luxury condominium in Pattaya, a beach resort city. He remained a fugitive for years. In 2002, authorities located him in Thailand. He was arrested and held for extradition. In 2004, Sullivan was extradited to the United States to stand trial. The trial began in February 2006 in Fulton County Superior Court in Atlanta. Judge John Goger presided. Lead prosecutor Paul Howard presented the case methodically. Philip Harwood testified and described in detail how Sullivan had hired him to kill Lita. Prosecutors introduced phone records showing that Sullivan had been on the phone with his attorney at the exact time of the murder, proving that the alibi had been orchestrated. They presented evidence of Sullivan's financial motive. Lita had rejected the $250,000 settlement and was positioned to take half his estate. They showed that Sullivan had sold the Atlanta mansion immediately after the murder and had remarried within months. The defense, led by attorney Don Samuel, argued that Harwood was a liar seeking a plea deal and that there was no physical evidence linking Sullivan to the crime. The jury was not convinced. After hearing the evidence, they convicted James Sullivan of murder. The prosecution had sought the death penalty, but the jury spared Sullivan's life. On March 13, 2006, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, Lita's father, Emory McClinton, addressed the court. He looked at James Sullivan and said, "He deserves to rot in hell." The McClinton family had waited 19 years for justice. Sullivan had lived freely and luxuriously for 15 of those years, funded by the money he had saved by murdering his wife. The conviction brought some measure of closure, but it could not erase the years of pain or bring Lita back. James Sullivan is 84 years old. He is incarcerated at Macon State Prison in Oglethorpe, Georgia. His inmate number is 0001-053424. He is serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. He will never be eligible for release. All appeals have been exhausted. James Sullivan hired a hitman to murder his wife for $25,000 because he did not want to pay her half his fortune in a divorce. Lita McClinton Sullivan was shot in her doorway while holding pink roses meant to deceive her into opening the door. Sullivan then spent 15 years living a billionaire lifestyle in Palm Beach and Thailand, funded entirely by the money he saved by having his wife assassinated. He attended parties, lived in mansions, remarried, and enjoyed wealth that should have been Lita's. When he was finally convicted in 2006, Emory McClinton said what everyone was thinking: he deserves to rot in hell. At 84, Sullivan remains in a Georgia prison. Lita McClinton never saw her 36th birthday. The pink roses that lured her to her death remain one of the cruelest details in a case built on cold financial calculation. Case 6. Robert Newlander. Dr. Robert Newlander instructed his adult daughter, Jenna, to call 911 on the morning of September 17th, 2012, and report that her mother had slipped and fallen in the shower. When police arrived at the 10,000 square foot mansion at the 7,000 block of Salt Springs Road in DeWitt, New York, they found Leslie Newlander, 61, dead in the master bathroom. Robert Newlander, a prominent obstetrician gynecologist in Syracuse, explained that his wife of 30 years had suffered from vertigo and had fallen while showering. The story was convincing until blood spatter experts examined the bedroom and found cast-off blood on the headboard and walls, evidence that was impossible if Leslie had died in the bathroom. The blood proved that Leslie Newlander had been bludgeoned to death in the bedroom and that her husband had carried her body to the shower, turned on the water, and staged an accident. What made the case even more disturbing was that Robert and Leslie's 4 adult children stood by their father through 2 trials, insisting he was innocent despite forensic evidence that proved he had murdered their mother. Robert M. Newlander was born in 1952 in the Syracuse, New York area. He attended Upstate Medical University and earned his medical degree, specializing in obstetrics and gynecology. He built a highly successful practice in Syracuse and became one of the most respected physicians in the region. He was prominent in the Syracuse Jewish community and enjoyed elite social standing. Robert married Leslie Newlander, and the couple had 4 adult children together. They lived in a 10,000 square foot mansion in DeWitt, a wealthy suburb of Syracuse. Before September 2012, Robert had never been arrested or convicted of any crime. By September 2012, the marriage was in crisis. Robert and Leslie were secretly undergoing a trial separation. Leslie was preparing to move to a separate apartment, and the couple was keeping the separation private from their community. A divorce would have divided their multi-million-dollar assets and damaged Robert's elite social standing. Robert could not accept it. Leslie Newlander was 61 when she died. She was a philanthropist and a prominent organizer in the Syracuse Jewish community. She was the mother of 4 adult children and had been married to Robert for 30 years. She was active in charitable work and was highly respected in Syracuse social circles. By September 2012, Leslie had made the decision to move forward with a separation from Robert. She was preparing to move to a separate apartment, and though the separation was being kept private, it was becoming permanent. Leslie was in her own home, going through her morning routine, when Robert attacked her. She trusted him. She had no reason to expect that he would kill her. Robert Newlander bludgeoned Leslie to death in their bedroom on the morning of September 17th, 2012 at approximately 8:00 a.m. The weapon used to inflict the blunt force trauma to her head was never identified, but the attack was brutal. Blood spatter was cast onto the bedroom headboard and the surrounding walls. The pattern of the blood showed that Leslie had been struck repeatedly. There was a massive amount of blood in the bedroom. After killing her, Robert carried Leslie's body from the bedroom to the master bathroom. He placed her in the shower and turned on the water. The water was intended to wash away blood and support the story Robert was about to tell. He then instructed his daughter Jenna to call 911. Jenna called and reported that her mother had fallen in the shower. Emergency responders arrived and found Leslie in the bathroom with the water running. Robert told them that Leslie had suffered from vertigo and had slipped and fallen. The story appeared plausible, and investigators initially treated the death as an accident. The medical examiner initially ruled Leslie's death accidental, but when the examiner reviewed the scene more carefully and examined the blood evidence, the ruling changed. blood spatter experts were brought in to analyze the bedroom. They found cast-off blood spatter on the bedroom headboard and on the walls surrounding the bed. The pattern was consistent with repeated blows to Leslie's head while she was in the bedroom. The volume of blood in the bedroom was far too great for a simple fall in the bathroom. The cast-off pattern indicated that the attack had taken place in the bedroom, not the bathroom. The medical examiner changed the manner of death from accident to homicide. It took nearly 2 years to build the case, but in June 2014, Robert Neuländer was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. Robert Neuländer faced trial twice. The first trial took place in 2015 in Onondaga County Court. Prosecutor William Fitzpatrick presented the blood spatter evidence and argued that Robert had killed Leslie in the bedroom and staged the bathroom fall. The defense argued that Leslie's fall had been a tragic accident and that the blood had been transferred to the bedroom when Robert performed CPR. The jury did not believe the defense. They convicted Robert of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years to life. But in 2019, the conviction was overturned. A juror had received prejudicial text messages during the trial, and the appellate court ruled that the juror misconduct warranted a new trial. The second trial took place in 2022. Judge Thomas Miller presided. The prosecution again presented the blood spatter evidence, showing that the cast-off pattern on the bedroom headboard and walls was impossible for a bathroom fall. The defense again argued that the blood had been transferred during CPR. Expert witnesses testified that the volume of blood and the cast-off pattern could only have resulted from an attack in the bedroom. Throughout both trials, all 4 of Robert and Leslie's adult children supported their father and testified for the defense. They insisted that Robert was innocent and that their mother's death had been an accident. On March 17, 2022, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. After the second conviction, Robert Neuländer was again sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The sentence was the same as the first trial. Leslie's extended family expressed frustration with the children's continued support of Robert despite the forensic evidence. The case had taken 10 years from the murder in 2012 to the final conviction in 2022, delayed by the juror misconduct and retrial. Robert Neuländer is 72 years old. He is incarcerated at Elmira Correctional Facility in New York. His inmate number is 22B1917. He is serving a sentence of 20 years to life. He will be eligible for parole after serving 20 years, which would make him approximately 92 years old. Given his age, it is unlikely he will live to see parole. Cast-off blood spatter on the bedroom headboard and walls prove that Leslie Neuländer was bludgeoned to death in her bedroom, not that she fell in a shower. Medical examiners, forensic experts, and 2 separate juries reached the same conclusion. Robert Neuländer murdered his wife and staged an accident. His 4 adult children attended both trials and defended him despite the evidence. They lost their mother to murder and refused to accept their father committed it. Robert Neuländer dedicated his career to women's health as an obstetrician gynecologist. He took an oath to do no harm. The blood evidence proved he violated that oath in the most intimate way possible by killing the mother of his children in their bedroom. The children's loyalty, unshaken by forensic proof, remains one of the most disturbing elements of a case that took 10 years to resolve. Case 7, Bob Ward, the 911 call from Isleworth, one of Florida's most exclusive gated communities, came at 8 p.m. on September 21st, 2009. The caller was Bob Ward, a 61-year-old real estate developer who lived in a $3.2 million mansion in the same neighborhood as Tiger Woods and other celebrities. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact. "I just shot my wife. She's dead. She's done." When Orange County Sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, they found Diane Ward, 55, dead from a single gunshot wound to the face from a .357 Magnum revolver. Forensic testing would reveal gunshot residue on Bob Ward's hands, but no residue on Diane's hands, disproving his later claims of self-defense or accident. The calm 911 confession, captured on audio and preserved as evidence, would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in a case that saw Bob Ward tried twice for his wife's murder. The millionaire developer's $3.2 million mansion, an elite gated community, could not protect Diane Ward from a gunshot to the face during an argument about the $200 million bankruptcy that was destroying the family's fortune. James Robert Ward was born around 1948. He was a college-educated businessman who built a career in commercial real estate development. He founded and ran Land Resource LLC, a company that had made him a multimillionaire. Bob married Diane Ward, and the couple was married for 30 years. They had 2 adult daughters, Sarah and Mallory. Bob and Diane lived in a $3.2 million mansion in Isleworth, an ultra-exclusive gated community in Windermere, Florida, where neighbors included Tiger Woods and other wealthy and famous residents. Before September 2009, Bob had never been arrested or convicted of any crime. But by September 2009, the wealth was an illusion. Land Resource LLC had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and was carrying $200 million in debt. The company was collapsing, and the lifestyle Bob had built was under threat. The stress of the financial crisis was enormous, and the pressure was tearing the family apart. Diane Ward had been married to Bob for 30 years and was the mother of Sarah and Mallory. She was a homemaker whose life had revolved around her family and the elite social circles of Isleworth. By September 2009, Diane was suffering from depression. The bankruptcy and the collapse of the family's financial security weighed heavily on her. She was allegedly intoxicated on the night of her death. She was stressed, depressed, and vulnerable. She was in her own home, arguing with her husband about the financial disaster that had overtaken their lives. She had no reason to believe the argument would end with a gunshot to her face. Bob and Diane Ward were arguing about the bankruptcy and the financial crisis on the evening of September 21st, 2009. The argument was heated. Diane was allegedly intoxicated, and both were under extreme stress. At approximately 8 p.m., Bob retrieved a .357 Magnum revolver and shot Diane once in the face at close range. The single shot killed her instantly. Immediately after shooting her, Bob called 911. His voice on the recording was calm and controlled. He said, "I just shot my wife. She's dead. She's done." There was no panic, no hysteria, no grief in his voice. He simply reported what he had done and waited for police to arrive. Orange County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Isleworth mansion within minutes. Bob Ward was cooperative and remained at the scene. He had called 911 himself and made no attempt to flee or hide what had happened. The .357 Magnum revolver was recovered. Forensic experts conducted gunshot residue testing. The results were clear. Gunshot residue was found on Bob Ward's hands, proving he had fired the weapon. No gunshot residue was found on Diane's hands, proving she had never touched the gun. The forensic evidence would become critical later when Bob claimed that Diane had been suicidal and that he had been wresting the gun away from her when it discharged. The lack of residue on her hands disproved that story completely. The 911 audio recording was preserved. Bob Ward was arrested on the night of September 21st, 2009, and charged with second-degree murder. Bob Ward faced trial twice. The first trial took place in 2011 in Orange County, Florida. The prosecution presented the 911 audio recording, the gunshot residue evidence, and the fact that Diane had been shot in the face at close range. The defense argued that Diane had been suicidal and that Bob had been trying to wrestle the gun away from her when it accidentally discharged. The jury did not believe the defense. They convicted Bob Ward of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But in 2016, the conviction was overturned on appeal. The appellate court ruled that Ward's defense attorney had failed to object to evidence regarding Ward's right to remain silent, and that the failure constituted ineffective assistance of counsel. A new trial was ordered. The second trial took place in 2018 in Orange County. Judge Letitia Marcus presided. The prosecution again presented the 911 audio, the gunshot residue evidence, and the close-range shot to Diane's face. The defense again argued that Diane had been suicidal and that the shooting had been accidental. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Diane had no gunshot residue on her hands, which meant she had never touched the gun. The shot to her face was inconsistent with a struggle over the weapon. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, but this time the charge was manslaughter rather than second-degree murder. The jury found Bob Ward less culpable than the original murder charge suggested, but they still found him criminally responsible for Diane's death. Despite the lesser charge of manslaughter, Judge Letitia Marcus imposed the maximum sentence. Bob Ward was sentenced to 30 years in prison in 2018, the same length as his original murder sentence. The judge determined that the maximum sentence was appropriate given the circumstances of the crime. Bob and Diane's daughters, Sarah and Mallory, spoke at the sentencing in support of their father. The family was divided over the verdict. The case had taken 9 years from the murder in 2009 to the final conviction in 2018, delayed by the appeal and retrial. Bob Ward would spend 3 decades in prison for shooting his wife in the face during an argument about bankruptcy. Bob Ward is 76 years old. He is incarcerated in a Florida Department of Corrections facility. His inmate number is M77874. He is serving a 30-year sentence. He will be eligible for release after serving 30 years, which would make him 91 years old. It is unlikely he will live to see that day. The audio recording of Bob Ward's 911 call is chilling not for what he says, but for how he says it. "I just shot my wife. She's dead. She's done. No panic. No hysteria. No grief. Just a calm, matter-of-fact report of executing his wife of 30 years. Inside one of America's most exclusive gated communities, where residents pay millions for security and privacy, a woman was shot in the face by her husband during an argument about bankruptcy. The gunshot residue evidence proved Diane Ward never touched the gun. The 911 audio proved Bob Ward knew exactly what he had done. At 76, he will spend the rest of his life in prison for it. Wealth and elite neighborhoods cannot protect anyone from domestic violence. The calm confession captured on that 911 call will remain one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in a case that took 2 trials to resolve. Case 8, Lyle and Eric Menendez neighbors, near 722 North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills. Heard what sounded like fireworks on the night of August 20th, 1989. Inside the mansion, Jose and Kitty Menendez had been shot multiple times with 12-gauge shotguns as they sat watching television in their den. The final shots, execution-style blasts to Jose's head and Kitty's face after both were already wounded, brought the total number of shotgun blasts to 16. Hours later, their sons Lyle and Eric called 911, screaming hysterically that they had returned home to find their parents murdered. 6 months later, after spending over $700,000 of their inheritance on Rolexes, a Porsche, courtside Lakers tickets, and luxury living, the brothers confessed to their psychologist that they had committed the murders. The case that followed would captivate America and divide the nation over a single question. Were Lyle and Eric Menendez cold-blooded killers who murdered their parents for a $14 million inheritance? Or were they desperate abuse victims who killed their abusers in fear for their lives? Joseph Lyle Menendez was born on January 10, 1968, in New York. He was 21 years old when the murders occurred. He is 56 years old today. Eric Galen Menendez was born on November 27, 1970, in New York. He was 18 years old at the time of the murders. He is 53 years old today. The brothers were the sons of Jose Menendez, a Cuban immigrant who had become a highly successful executive at Live Entertainment, and Mary Louise "Kitty" Menendez, a former beauty queen. The family lived in Beverly Hills and enjoyed extraordinary wealth. Lyle attended Princeton University, but was suspended for plagiarism and academic dishonesty. Eric was a talented tennis player who had graduated from high school. Neither brother had legitimate employment. Before the murders, both brothers had committed burglaries in Calabasas, stealing over $100,000 in items from homes in the area. The defense would later claim that both Lyle and Eric suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse by their father, and that their mother had known about the abuse and had enabled it. The prosecution would argue that the brothers were entitled greedy young men who murdered their parents to inherit $14 million. Jose Menendez was 45 when he died. He was a Cuban immigrant who had built a fortune in the entertainment industry as an executive at Live Entertainment. He was demanding, controlling, and, according to the defense, a violent sexual predator who had abused both of his sons for years. The prosecution portrayed him as a successful, self-made executive and a demanding but not abusive father. Mary Louise "Kitty" Menendez was 47 when she was killed. She was a former beauty queen and a homemaker who struggled with depression and substance abuse. The defense claimed that Kitty knew about the abuse her husband inflicted on their sons and had failed to protect them. The prosecution portrayed her as a loving mother. The family appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream, living in a Beverly Hills mansion and enjoying wealth and privilege. But according to the defense, the home was a place of terror. In the days before August 20th, 1989, Lyle and Eric Menendez purchased 12-gauge shotguns using a fake ID. They drove to San Diego to buy the weapons to avoid being recognized in Los Angeles. They practiced shooting. On the night of August 20th, 1989, at approximately 10 p.m., Jose and Kitty Menendez were sitting in the den of their home at 722 North Elm Drive, watching television. Lyle and Eric entered the room armed with the shotguns. They opened fire. Jose was shot 6 times. Kitty was shot 10 times. The initial blasts wounded both parents. Kitty tried to crawl away. The brothers reloaded. Then they fired the final execution shots. Jose was shot in the back of the head at contact range. Kitty was shot in the face. The brothers fired a total of 16 shotgun blasts. After the murders, Lyle and Eric left the house. They disposed of the shotguns and their bloody clothing. The weapons and clothing were never recovered. They drove to a movie theater to establish an alibi. Then they returned home. At 11:47 p.m., they called 911. They were screaming and hysterical. They told the operator that someone had killed their parents. When police arrived, the crime scene was horrific. The 16 shotgun shell casings told the story of overkill and rage. Over the next 6 months, Lyle and Eric spent over $700,000 of their inheritance. They bought Rolex watches, a Porsche, expensive clothing, courtside seats to Lakers games, and invested in businesses. The spending spree drew the attention of investigators, but there was no physical evidence linking the brothers to the murders. In March 1990, Eric Menendez confessed to his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. During therapy sessions, Eric broke down and admitted that he and Lyle had killed their parents. Lyle later joined the sessions. Dr. Oziel recorded some of the sessions. Months later, Dr. Oziel's mistress, Judalyn Smith, went to the police and told them about the confessions. On March 8, 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested at the family mansion in Beverly Hills. Eric was arrested at Los Angeles International Airport as he returned from a trip to Israel. Both brothers were charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The Menendez brothers would face 3 separate trials over 7 years. The first trials took place in 1993. Each brother had a separate jury, but both juries heard the same evidence. The trials were broadcast live on court TV and became a media sensation. Lyle and Eric both testified in graphic detail about years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse by their father. Family members testified about signs of abuse. The defense, led by attorney Leslie Abramson for Eric, argued that the brothers had killed in imperfect self-defense because they feared their parents were going to kill them. The prosecution argued that the murders were premeditated and motivated by greed. Both juries deadlocked. The trials ended in mistrials, with the juries unable to agree on whether the killings were murder or manslaughter. The second trial began in 1995. This time, the brothers were tried together with a single jury. Judge Stanley Weisberg presided. Critically, the judge limited the amount of abuse evidence that could be presented, which weakened the defense. The prosecution presented the evidence of premeditation, the shotgun purchases, the execution shots, the disposal of weapons, the spending spree. The defense again argued abuse and fear. But the jury was not convinced. On March 20th, 1996, Lyle and Eric Menendez were convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The jury rejected the abuse defense. On July 2nd, 1996, Judge Stanley Weisberg sentenced both brothers to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The death penalty was not imposed. The brothers were separated and sent to different prisons. They would not see each other for decades. In 2018, they were reunited at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California, where they remain today. For years, the case seemed closed, but in 2023, new evidence emerged. A letter written by Eric to his cousin 8 months before the murders was discovered. In the letter, Eric described ongoing sexual abuse by his father. The letter corroborated the abuse claims and proved that Eric had been talking about the abuse before the murders, not after. In 2023, Roy Rosselló, a former member of the boy band Menudo, came forward and alleged that Jose Menendez had raped him in the 1980s when Rosselló was a teenager. The allegation corroborated the defense's claims that Jose Menendez was a sexual predator. In October 2024, Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon recommended that Lyle and Eric be resentenced based on the new evidence. Gascon proposed resentencing them to 50 years to life, which would make them immediately eligible for parole because they have already served 35 years. A resentencing hearing is expected in 2025. Lyle Menendez is 56 years old. Eric Menendez is 53 years old. Both brothers are incarcerated at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California. Lyle's inmate number is C89096. Eric's inmate number is J84065. They are currently serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, based on the district attorney's October 2024 recommendation for resentencing, they could be resentenced to 50 years to life, which would make them immediately eligible for parole. A hearing is expected in 2025. If the resentencing is granted, the brothers could be released after serving 35 years. For 35 years, the question has divided America. Were Lyle and Eric Menendez cold-blooded killers who murdered their parents for $14 million? Or were they desperate abuse victims who killed their abusers in fear? The execution shots, final blasts to Jose's head and Kitty's face after both were wounded, seemed to prove murder. But in 2023, new evidence emerged. A letter Eric wrote describing abuse months before the murders, and a former Menudo member alleging Jose Menendez raped him. In October 2024, the Los Angeles District Attorney recommended resentencing. If granted, the brothers could walk free in 2025. The case that captivated America in the 1990s has returned with a question. Did we get it wrong? The answer may come soon. Case 9. John Brooks. Jack Reed drove to a horse barn in Deerfield, New Hampshire on June 27, 2005, believing he was meeting a potential client who wanted to hire him for a contracting job. Instead, 3 men were waiting inside the barn with a sledgehammer. The ambush had been arranged by Reed's former employer, John Brooks, a Las Vegas millionaire who owned a massive moving and freight company. Brooks had become convinced that Reed had stolen trailers and equipment from him. Rather than call the police or pursue a civil lawsuit, Brooks hired 3 hitmen and purchased a sledgehammer at a Home Depot in New Hampshire. Surveillance cameras captured the purchase. Hours later, Jack Reed was beaten to death in the barn. The video of Brooks buying the murder weapon would become the defining piece of evidence in a case that showed how wealth and paranoia can turn a business dispute into murder. John Brooks was born around 1952. Details of his early life and personal background remain limited. By 2005, Brooks was 53 years old and had built a fortune in the moving and freight business. He owned a massive Las Vegas-based moving company and lived a lavish lifestyle between Las Vegas and his New Hampshire compound, where he owned multiple properties. Brooks was a multimillionaire. By 2005, he had become increasingly paranoid. He became fixated on the belief that employees and former employees were stealing from him. Jack Reed, a handyman and contractor who had worked for Brooks and helped manage his properties, became the target of Brooks' suspicion. Brooks was convinced that Reed had stolen trailers and moving equipment. There was no evidence that Reed had actually stolen anything. The accusation existed only in Brooks' mind. Rather than pursue legal action or call the police, Brooks decided to have Reed killed. Jack Reed was 57 and had worked for years as a handyman and contractor. He had been employed by John Brooks and had helped manage Brooks' properties in New Hampshire. By 2005, Reed was working independently as a contractor. He had no reason to believe that his former employer viewed him as a threat or had plans to kill him. When Brooks or the hitmen contacted Reed with an offer of a contracting job, Reed accepted. He drove to the barn on Brooks' property expecting to discuss work. He had no idea he was walking into an ambush. In early 2005, John Brooks became convinced that Jack Reed had stolen trailers and equipment from his moving company. Brooks hired 3 hitmen. The specific identities of the hitmen were not detailed in available records, but they agreed to carry out the murder. Brooks went to a Home Depot in New Hampshire and purchased a sledgehammer. Surveillance cameras at the store captured Brooks selecting and purchasing the weapon. The video footage was date-stamped and showed Brooks clearly. On June 27, 2005, Reed was lured to a horse barn in Deerfield, New Hampshire, under the pretense of being offered a contracting job. When Reed arrived at the barn, the 3 hitmen were waiting. They attacked him immediately. They beat Jack Reed to death with the sledgehammer that Brooks had purchased. Reed died in the barn. The murder was brutal and calculated. Brooks had arranged everything: the hitmen, the weapon, the location, and the lure. The investigation into Jack Reed's murder quickly focused on John Brooks. Reed's body was found in the barn, and the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma from the sledgehammer. Investigators recovered the weapon or found evidence linking it to the crime. The breakthrough came from the Home Depot surveillance video. The footage showed John Brooks purchasing the sledgehammer that had been used to kill Reed. The video was clear, date-stamped, and directly tied Brooks to the murder weapon. Phone records connected Brooks to the hitmen, showing that there had been communication before and after the murder. The records established that Brooks had coordinated with the killers. The 3 hitmen were likely arrested and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, though specific details of their cooperation were not available in research. Their testimony would have identified Brooks as the person who hired them and provided the weapon. John Brooks was arrested sometime after June 2005 and charged with capital murder. The charge of capital murder applied because the crime was murder for hire. The trial took place in 2008 in Rockingham County Superior Court in New Hampshire. Though trial details were not extensively documented in available records, the prosecution presented the Home Depot surveillance video showing Brooks purchasing the sledgehammer. They introduced phone records linking Brooks to the hitmen. They presented the allegation that Brooks had been convinced Reed stole equipment and had hired killers, rather than using the legal system. The hitmen likely testified as cooperating witnesses, describing how Brooks had hired them and provided the murder weapon. The defense strategy was not specified in available information, but likely involved denying Brooks' involvement or knowledge. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted John Brooks of capital murder, a charge reserved for murder for hire and other aggravated forms of homicide. The conviction carried a sentence of life without the possibility of parole in New Hampshire. In 2008, John Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge imposed the sentence based on the capital murder conviction. Details of victim impact statements or courtroom reactions were not available in research, but Jack Reed's family presumably attended the sentencing to see justice delivered. The 3 hitmen likely received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation, though specific details were not documented. The case became notable for the Home Depot surveillance video, which provided clear visual evidence connecting a wealthy businessman to a murder weapon. John Brooks is approximately 72 years old. He is incarcerated at the New Hampshire State Prison for Men. He is serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. He will never be eligible for release. Information about his inmate number and the status of any appeals was not available in research. John Brooks believed Jack Reed had stolen equipment from his moving company. Rather than call the police or pursue a civil lawsuit, Brooks hired 3 hitmen and purchased a sledgehammer at a New Hampshire Home Depot. Surveillance cameras captured him selecting the weapon that would be used to beat his former employee to death in a barn on Brooks' property. The multimillionaire who owned a Las Vegas freight empire apparently believed his wealth placed him above the law. The Home Depot video proved otherwise. At 72, Brooks will spend the rest of his life in a New Hampshire prison for a murder he could have avoided by simply making a phone call to police. The sledgehammer he purchased on camera became the instrument of a murder driven by paranoia and the arrogant belief that money could solve any problem, including one that existed only in his mind. Case 10. Santa Kimes. Irene Silverman, an 82-year-old former Radio City Rockette and wealthy Manhattan socialite, disappeared from her townhouse at 20 East 65th Street on July 5, 1998. The same day, police arrested a mother and son. Sante Kimis, 64, and Kenneth Kimis Jr., 23, for an unrelated fraud. When officers searched the pair, they found Irene Silverman's personal keys, a forged deed transferring her $7 million townhouse into their names, loaded handguns, a stun gun, and notebooks containing detailed plans for murder and body disposal. Silverman's body has never been found, but in 2000, a jury convicted Sante and Kenneth Kimes of second-degree murder, robbery, and forgery without ever recovering the body. The case revealed a mother-son criminal partnership that had operated like a corporation of crime for decades, committing slavery, arson, insurance fraud, theft, and ultimately murder. Sante Kims had raised her son to be her accomplice, and together they had targeted an elderly widow for her Manhattan real estate, strangled her, disposed of her body so thoroughly it has never been discovered, and attempted to steal her home using forged documents. Justice was delivered despite the missing body, but Irene Silverman's remains are still lost. Sante Kimis was born Sandra Louise Singers on July 24, 1934, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Her childhood was troubled. Her mother was a prostitute, and Sante spent time in multiple foster homes. She graduated from high school but never pursued higher education. She married Kenneth Kims Sr., a wealthy developer who died in 1994. Sante had a son, Kenneth Kimis Jr., who was born in 1975. Sante never held legitimate employment. She was a lifelong grifter, thief, and fraudster. Before the Silverman murder, Sante had been arrested and convicted multiple times for slavery, arson, insurance fraud, theft, and forgery. She had kept domestic workers as slaves, forced them to work without pay, and held them against their will. She had committed arson to collect insurance money. She had stolen properties through elaborate fraud schemes. She was described by psychologists as sociopathic and a pathological liar. Despite having no legitimate income, Sante had amassed millions of dollars through illegal means. She was constantly moving from place to place to escape legal consequences. Kenneth Kimes Jr. was born in 1975 and was 23 years old at the time of the Silverman murder. He had been raised by Sante in a criminal lifestyle and served as her accomplice in schemes. He was under his mother's control and had been trained to carry out her plans. Irene Silverman was 82 when she disappeared. She was a former Radio City Rockette, a dancer who had performed at one of New York City's most iconic venues. She had become a prominent socialite and had built wealth over her lifetime. She was a widow, and details of her family were not extensively documented, but she had no close family members who could protect her. She owned an incredibly valuable townhouse at 20 East 65th Street in Manhattan, worth $7 million. She rented out high-end apartments in the townhouse to wealthy tenants. In early 1998, a man using the alias Manny Guerin rented an apartment in her building. Manny Guerin was actually Kenneth Kimes Jr. Irene became suspicious of Guerin. She told her building staff that she did not trust him and that something was wrong, but she could not prove anything illegal. Surveillance cameras in the building captured Sante and Kenneth coming and going. Irene was elderly, lived alone, and owned extraordinarily valuable property. She was the perfect target for Sante and Kenneth's scheme. In early 1998, Sante and Kenneth Kimes identified Irene Silverman as a target. They researched her and determined that she was an elderly widow who owned a $7 million townhouse in Manhattan. They devised a plan to murder her, forge ownership documents, and steal the property. Kenneth rented an apartment in Irene's townhouse under the false identity of Manny Guerin. This gave him access to the building and allowed Sante and Kenneth to case the property and learn Irene's routines. They prepared forged deed documents in advance, creating paperwork that would transfer ownership of the townhouse from Irene to them. They purchased supplies for the murder and for disposing of Irene's body. On July 5th, 1998, Sante and Kenneth entered the townhouse. They confronted Irene Silverman. They strangled her. The exact method of strangulation was not specified, but Irene was killed in the townhouse. After murdering her, Sante and Kenneth disposed of her body. The method and location of disposal were never discovered. Irene Silverman's body has never been found, despite extensive searches. Sante and Kenneth then attempted to execute the next phase of their plan. They had forged documents that appeared to show Irene had transferred ownership of the townhouse to them. They planned to take possession of the $7 million property and claim it as their own. On July 5th, 1998, the same day Irene Silverman was murdered, Sante and Kenneth Kims were arrested in New York City for an unrelated fraud. The timing was extraordinary. Building staff had reported Irene missing, but Sante and Kenneth were arrested before they could complete their plan to take possession of the townhouse. When police searched Sante and Kenneth after their arrest, they found damning evidence. In their possession were the forged deed to Irene Silverman's townhouse, Irene's personal keys, loaded handguns, a stun gun, and notebooks containing detailed plans for murder and body disposal. The evidence connected them directly to Irene's disappearance. Building surveillance footage showed Sante and Kenneth entering and leaving the townhouse. Staff testified that Irene had been suspicious of Manny Guerin, the alias Kenneth had used. Handwriting experts analyzed the forged deed and determined that Irene's signature had been forged. Despite extensive searches, Irene's body was never recovered. Sante and Kenneth were charged with second-degree murder, robbery, conspiracy, and forgery. The trial took place in 2000 in New York County Supreme Court in Manhattan. Both Sante and Kenneth were tried together. The prosecution presented the forged deed found in their possession, Irene Silverman's personal keys, surveillance footage showing them in the building, the notebooks detailing murder plans, and the weapons including the stun gun and loaded handguns. Handwriting experts testified that Irene's signature on the deed was forged. Building staff testified about Irene's suspicions of Manny Guerin. The prosecution also introduced pattern evidence showing Sante's long history of fraud, theft, and slavery. The defense, led by attorneys Michael Hardy for Sante and Jose Muniz for Kenneth, argued that without a body, there was no proof of murder. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial and that Irene could still be alive. The jury rejected the defense arguments. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged deed with Irene's personal keys in their possession, the notebooks with murder plans, and the surveillance footage proved guilt. In 2000, the jury convicted both Sante Kims and Kenneth Kims Jr. of second-degree murder, robbery, and forgery. The conviction without a body was rare but legally sound given the strength of the evidence. In 2000, Sante Kims was sentenced to 120 years to life in prison. Kenneth Kims Jr. was also sentenced to 120 years to life, though his sentence was later reduced in subsequent proceedings. The sentences were consecutive, reflecting multiple convictions for murder, robbery, and forgery. Sante maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings. Both Sante and Kenneth were also convicted of murdering David Kasdan, a businessman in Los Angeles whom they had killed for financial gain. The Kasdan murder was part of the same pattern of killing for money. Sante Kims was sent to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Bedford Hills, New York. She remained there for the rest of her life. On May 19, 2014, Sante Kims died of natural causes in prison. She was 79 years old. She had served 14 years of her 120-year sentence. Kenneth Kims Jr. remains incarcerated and is serving his sentence. Santa Keems is deceased. She died on May 19, 2014, at age 79, of natural causes while incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. She served 14 years of a 120-year sentence. Kenneth Keems Jr. is still incarcerated and serving a 120-year sentence for the murder of Irene Silverman and other crimes. Santa Keems raised her son Kenneth to be her criminal partner. Together, they enslaved domestic workers, committed arson for insurance money, stole properties through fraud, and murdered at least 2 people for financial gain. When they targeted 82-year-old Irene Silverman for her $7 million Manhattan townhouse, they strangled her and disposed of her body so thoroughly it has never been found. But the forged deed with Silverman's signature, her personal keys, and the notebooks detailing their murder plans were found in their possession hours after the killing. A jury convicted them without a body. Santa died in prison at 79. Kenneth remains incarcerated. Irene Silverman's body is still missing, but justice was delivered anyway. The mother-son criminal duo operated like a corporation of crime for decades. And in the end, their greed and arrogance left a trail of evidence that convicted them, even without the body of their victim.